Go ahead and get started. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another exciting tiny webinar. Today is the state of employee engagement, Q2 of 2021. So every quarter we track the data, what's going on in employee engagement, what's going on in terms of, what's top of mind for leaders like you, where we mash up all the topics from burnout to turnover, to vaccine policy, returning to work, hybrid work models, and that is the topic of today. So before I welcome our guests today, be sure to follow us on LinkedIn at Tiny Pulse to get invites to events just like this one. You also get all of our reports as well as other great content on how to create happier, high-performing employees and teams within your organization. So welcoming the authors of this quarter's Q2 research, Dr. Elora Voyles, people scientist for Tiny Pulse, former associate professor of IO psychology, as well as founder and CEO of Tiny Pulse, David New. I'm so excited to have you both here. David will introduce us today, but before I forget, do not forget to leave feedback in today's exit survey. You'll get that right as you exit. If you have to leave early, you'll still get it. We'd love to hear from you. We are a feedback company. Let us know. Let us know how we can do better, and love to incorporate your comments for next and future Tiny webinars. So David New, founder and CEO of Tiny Pulse, what will you share with us today?
Yes. Well, first of all, thanks everyone for showing up, and especially for the people who actually took the survey about a month and a half ago. And for those people, if you did take the survey, we have a customized version where you'll see your responses against the benchmarks. So all you have to do to get that is put that in the chat or email Dear Andrew at Tiny Pulse, and you can get your customized version. For everyone else, Andrew will drop in the chat a link so that you can get all the data, so you don't have to take screenshots of the slides, and we'll pass them along to you so that you can have great conversations internally with your team. And, I think one of the things that gets me so excited is we're at this amazing inflection point. This was just covered in CNBC a couple of days ago about the turnover tsunami versus the turnover trickle, right? And people are reopening, HR priorities are focusing on growth. People are embracing hybrid, eschewing vaccines, formalized vaccine policy, but variants are looming. So there's mounting challenges for people, leaders such as yourself. And how do we balance that? How do we make the right decisions? And hopefully the insights that we are going to share with you today will enable you to be better armed to have these substantive discussions to make the right decision. And of course, being able to slice and dice and look at advanced attribution of your people population, because it is certainly not one size fits all, as Dr. Voyles will share more. And then finally, before I pass it on to her, there's so much content in this report, and when you see it, you'll understand what I'm saying. So we're going to try to make it as interactive as possible. And throughout it, please drop in messages and comments. And we will definitely respond. And we also have more fun when we get to hear your side as well. So with that, I will pass it over to Dr. Voyles.
Thanks, David, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us to talk about the state of employee engagement in Q2 2021. Like David said, feel free to jump in at any time if you have any questions or if something really rings true for you. At this time, we're going to drop a poll for you. Basically, we want to, or hold on, actually, we're going to drop the poll in a second. Basically, we want to get a sense of what topics are most interesting to you. So the poll should be up on your screen now. It's kind of a question of whether you want to talk about employee stress and burnout, parental and partner status and how that affects your employees and their return to work attitudes, as well as their happiness, return to work policies in general, vaccine status and policies, as well as people, priorities, and turnover, which includes things that we're really interested in, like being able to hire and also attrition, which is a huge concern now. So go ahead and select which topic is most important to you, and we'll actually do them in order of what's most important to everyone. And we'll cover as much as we possibly can. But again, if we don't cover the topic that you wanted to hear, feel free to reach out and you can get the full report. Okay, so just to give you a very brief setup of our research, we surveyed over 700 HR professionals, and I bet that many of you who are listening today were some of those HR professionals and leaders who were giving us insights about their changing workplace. And so we conducted this study from May 10th to 2000 or to May 24th, and we had a huge range of organizations from very small organizations to over 2 million employees for some organizations. This is also a worldwide study, so we included over 400 countries. We had a pretty even distribution of gender and race, and then we also had over 30 different industries covered. It looks like our top priorities in terms of what you guys would like to learn more about is people priorities and turnover, followed by employee stress and burnout, and then return to work. And then if we have time, we'll get into the parental and partner status and vaccine status. So let me go ahead and make sure I have those all ordered.
Yeah, so the first one
Okay.
will be slide 34 for the people priorities and turnover, which is seems like the overwhelming favorite.
Okay. Oh, let's hit that executive summary just so everybody can get a taste of everything that we learned, or at least the big highlights. So one of the big highlights that we first found was that hybrid's here to stay. There are a variety of different reasons why hybrid is here to stay, and part of it is for employee wellness. We found that employees who were working hybrid were less emotionally exhausted compared to those who were working fully remotely. And then we found that those who were working in person had the least emotional exhaustion. Performance. So what's interesting is that 63% of HR leaders and C-suite leaders said that hybrid actually optimizes performance. So we'll dig into those results some more. And then we also found that fewer required in-person days in the office related to better predicted retention. Vaccinations, this is kind of one of the big ones. It's been talked about so much in terms of whether they should be mandated, but we found that very few organizations actually mandated. In fact, only 7% mandated, whereas the majority, 48%, encouraged vaccinations. And then we also found that HR priorities have really shifted since Q1. So we did this study in Q1 as well. And we found in Q1, it was really focused on employee engagement and like mental health, topics like that. But in Q2, those were not prioritized as much. And instead, remote onboarding, hiring talent really increased in terms of how high they were in priority. And then here's the big one, the turnover tsunami versus trickle, which since you all voted for this section first, this is the one we'll actually get really deep into now. But Microsoft research predicted 41% of employees are considering leaving their employer. There have been various ranges from 26% up to 95%, although that one's from monster.com. And most people on monster.com are actively looking for jobs. But we found that only 8% of HR leaders and C-suite leaders were they thought only 8% of their employees would turn over after the restrictions are lifted. So overwhelmingly, they were predicting, HR leaders and C-suite leaders are predicting low attrition, but other surveys say otherwise. There's also increased demand for advanced attributions. So these advanced attributions are looking at things like the employee kind of demographics and characteristics. Things like it could be the level in the organization, could be gender, could be race, tenure, specific department, geographic location. It could even be if they're a fully remote employee versus a hybrid employee. So these advanced attributions can help shed light on how different employees will react to policies that you make in your organization. So that's something we're going to touch on as well. Andrew and David, I see that the chat's blowing up, so let me know if there's anything I gotta hit up right away.
Yeah, well, thank you, Dustin, for that comment. Do you attribute the lower percentage to higher ups being naive and optimistic? And I'm assuming, Dustin, that's related to the turnover tsunami versus the turnover trickle, which is very appropriate because we're going to go to that section. And I believe there's going to be a poll that we're going to drop to see for this audience, is there a difference than the folks that we just surveyed about a month and a half ago?
Mhm. Yeah, it's a big question, and it's something that we've discussed with like the news and media outlets in our interviews, as well as kind of what is the source of this discrepancy. So now we'll go to, I believe it was slide 34, so we can get into those details. Here we are.
And that poll question just dropped. So be super interesting to see these results and compare them.
Yeah, so we'd like to see what you say compared to what we found in our research. So in your opinion, what percentage of employees in your organization will quit after COVID-19 restrictions have fully lifted? And that's the big focus in our people priorities and turnover section. We know that it's important to focus on retaining the top talent so that you don't have to go through the cost and the investment of recruiting new employees and training new employees. All right. So while we're waiting for the results on the poll, I'll just kind of cover a little bit of this. And it's basically, we were looking at the priorities in terms of 2021 Q1 and Q2. So we wanted to look at what HR leaders and C-suite leaders saw as most important. And on the left side, you see the comparison with Q1 being in blue, Q2 being in red. On the right side of the slide, you can see which ones have increased and which ones have decreased. So all of the bars that are red on the right side are decreases. So return to work is less of a policy, vaccine policy, social justice, all of those in a big way have decreased. Instead, now HR and C-suite leaders are focused on remote onboarding, hiring talent, performance management, and safety. So this kind of shows a shift in priorities. And some of this may be due to the fact that organizations are kind of recovering. We feel that we're, coming out of the pandemic hesitantly because there could be possibilities of different variants. However, organizations are starting to try to return to work and bring in more talent. All right, here's our poll. Ooh, it's higher than what we found. So actually, let me see if I can get to the next slide on attrition, just so we can kind of compare side by side.
Yep.
Yeah, so we found that our majority in our study was 0 to 9%. That's the predicted attrition. So out of 100 employees, HR leaders were predicting between 0 and 9 employees would leave out of 100. It seems that here everyone's kind of more shifted towards 10 to 19%, with some even saying 30 to 39%, none over 40% plus. So that's a good sign so far. I'm curious, drop it in the chat. Have you seen an uptick in attrition since May, even like in the past month? Has it kind of ticked up? That's what we heard in our last presentation, was that there was kind of a shift going on.
Yeah.
But we found that 68.15% cited that they believe it's 0 to 9%. And then we found also that over 25% of the people leaders suggested that 0% or no one is going to leave their organization. And so this gets back to, what was the question asker's name? Is it
for
the attrition question?
Oh, I think that was Dustin, right?
Dustin. Yeah. Yes. So this gets back to Dustin's question, is like, are they overly optimistic? What's kind of going on here? Some of that may be optimism. Some of it also could be that workers have been working remotely, and so they're not seeing their workers day to day, and they don't know as well kind of how they're doing and whether they're fully committed to the organization.
Yeah, and Dr. Voyles, since you asked the question, it's been fast and furious on the chat, and it seems Allison's lost several, Jules has lost last 30 days, there's been an uptick. Edna, June was brutal, 10%. Kimberly, yes, looking for more money and work-life balance. Tammy, yes. Megan, yes, we lost as many associates in June as we had all year up to that point. Matthew. Yeah, so definitely I'm
I'm
seeing
seeing it too.
that there's so many, I can't even read them. So thank you everyone for contributing, but it feels like maybe there's this big blind spot where these people leaders are thinking like, oh, no one's going to quit. Like we were shocked. Like we actually had to slice the data again to see that it was so low. And the average we is like about 8%. You folks are saying the average is much higher based on the poll results. And then the qualitative feedback also points to that it's going to be higher.
Yeah, and I think just the fact that there's so much turnover kind of contributes to this really competitive job market, which kind of puts it more in the hands of the employees seeking work rather than the employers. And that was Tammy's point as well, is just that it's kind of changed in terms of who has the advantage.
Yeah.
We also broke it down by industry because we were curious to see, if there's a difference in certain industries. Particularly one I thought that would be different would be retail. However, we didn't find that here in our data, but we did find that the industry with the highest predicted attrition was computers and technology. And so that can be an area where there might be challenge as well. So this is a trend to watch. This is something that is going to really affect your organization, particularly if you do start to kind of see that uptick in attrition. Something else to kind of add on to that. So this is another kind of lookout. We asked how challenging it is to fill open roles. And so if you're losing employees, it's also kind of a big question of, okay, well, how quickly can we fill those positions with qualified candidates? And we found that 39% of the HR leaders and C-suite leaders that we asked said it was more challenging to fill open roles compared to 18% who said it was less challenging. And then we had a 42% in the middle who said it's about the same. But this indicates that there might be some challenges ahead for HR who, have already had a challenging past year and a half, just with employees potentially leaving, as well as the challenge of filling open roles.
Yeah, and I feel like this is so interesting because they think that the attrition will be low, but then they're acknowledging the fact that it's more challenging, which seems in alignment with a lot of the participant feedback as well.
Yeah, and I'd love to see you all chime in, and again in the chat, has it been challenging to fill those open roles that you have? I've been hearing that it has become more challenging, and it might continue to do so.
Yeah. And Dustin, I love your question about, I love to hear if Tiny Pulse has seen any of the similar numbers, or if you managed to avoid this given your culture and care for your team. And so we have our primary office here in Seattle. And I would say that our attrition right now is probably around that 10% range that a lot of you folks, and that's consistent with the study. However, we're still in July is kind of optional, 2 days a week in the office for people. So as it keeps unfolding, we'll see what happens, but we feel like we have a pretty good pulse on how the people with using, asking them and also conducting a one-on-one pulse. So happy to share that. And thanks for that question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And David's kind of touching on something that we're going to talk about a little bit more in a second, but we believe that one of the kind of things that might be sparking turnover in certain employees is the type of return to work plan that your organizations are implementing. So we'll get there in a moment too. But we wanted to look at kind of what factors were fueling HR predictors or HR managers' predictions for attrition. And we found that HR managers were likely to predict more attrition when employees were having difficulties adjusting with remote work, as well as lower motivation, uncertainty about that return to work, obviously lower commitment, and so on. So if they're experiencing a lot of barriers and kind of a lot of that feeling of being run down, they're going, and including burnout, they're going to be more likely to turn over. But we found that happiness insulates them from that attrition. So happiness is something that can reduce some of the attrition if you make sure that your employees are happy on the job. All right, and this is what David alluded to. So some things that might spark that turnover in certain employees is the type of return to work plan that your organization has. We looked at the predicted attrition from the HR leaders compared to the number of required return to work days in the office that they reported. And we found that with more required office days, specifically 4 days a week, they predicted more employees would turn over. So if they had 4 days in the office required, there would be almost a 14% kind of turnover rate predicted. But 3 days, 2 days, and so on, it's all below 10%. So it's definitely something to consider when developing these plans.
Yeah, and just to chime in, Dr. Voyles, is someone in the Q&A asked, do you find there's a correlation higher attrition and return to on-site work? Are employees more inclined to offer hybrid or fully remote options in order to keep talent? Do you have recommendations around this? And I think it's very apropos that you just brought that up, is that, it looks like, they expect more attrition if you ask people to come back 4 to 5 days a week than, 1 to 3.
They do. And so I would have a couple of recommendations. My first recommendation would be to make sure to survey your employees to get a sense of what their attitudes are towards returning to work. Because if you don't survey and you just put out a policy, one, employees will feel like their voices have not been heard. Two, you'll be totally tone deaf on what they want or need. And so you may put out a policy that you think would be well accepted and then find a lot of backlash and subsequently turnover. So I would say definitely survey your employees to get a sense of that. You'll also want to look at your employees' characteristics. So if you have, a lot of single parents, or if you have a lot of people who are commuting from a far distance, you may want to see how their survey responses differ compared to other employees and develop your policies accordingly.
Yeah, and we also have a good question from Brian. Curious why you think 3 and 5 days have almost the same attrition numbers. And Dr. Voyles and I, we discussed this, and our hypothesis is like, if you are an organization that you have to be there 5 days a week in certain industries, that attrition is going to be about the same as if you offer the hybrid of 1 to 3. Is that 4 that looks like, you have to, you have options, but you're being forced to go maybe more on site. That was what we discussed. But do you have any more color on that, Dr. Voyles?
Exactly. And also the ones who responded that they were 5 days a week were likely already doing that. So if any attrition were to happen, it would have already occurred. And so that's why they're predicting a lower amount compared to the 4 days. But the 4 days a week, like you said, it's kind of just that big, like, oh, well, we don't have to be there, but they're making us be there for 4 days a week. All right, so just to kind of hit on some of these key insights and implications, this year has shown a huge shift in terms of remote work as well as priorities for HR and human resources leaders. It's been pretty mind-boggling in terms of what human resources and organizational leaders have had to manage. For Q2, we've really kind of noticed a shift in more kind of hiring, remote onboarding, and less towards kind of that engagement and less towards kind of surveys and like return to work policies. And then a lot of HR leaders think that that great resignation is more of a trickle. However, it sounds like the tide is turning and people are recognizing that it's not a trickle, it's definitely more than that. And then we also found that it's harder to hire. So there's kind of this big storm of losing employees, but also having a harder time getting new employees. And we found that some of the big drivers for losing employees are things like having difficulty adjusting to remote work, being required to work more days in the office, like 4 days a work week, and that can turn over to or can predict more turnover. So we're at a really critical time in terms of HR and organizations, and it's important to formulate your return to work policies in an informed way. So surveying your employees and really keeping kind of the pulse on them. I would also suggest not backing away from HR priorities like employee engagement. That will help kind of solve the issue with losing employees through what we call the leaky bucket. With the leaky bucket, it's you have this bucket, you have you're losing employees out the bottom, but you're also trying to fill the bucket at the same time. And so in order to prevent that, make sure you focus on employee engagement for your current top talent.
Yeah, and I also like to add, Dr. Voyles, is,
Mhm.
I think this is a key slide if you share with your executive team or your people leadership team is, there is this market shift and like, hey, we got to grow and we're going to invest in growth, but there's so many headwinds. You say it's harder, people are saying it's harder, you're losing people, so you have this leaky bucket. So it's really important to also set proper expectations with your leadership team, because I know you folks are burnt out. And it's clear from the data that emotional exhaustion for you and your team are running high. So, I mean, a lot of people, it's challenging. We feel that, and the data supports that, is to have those candid conversations. Because if you're trying to hire, let's say 15% more folks with a limited budget, taking your eye off the ball from engagement and taking care of your current folks who are emotionally burnt out, it's not going to be a great recipe for success. So, that's, I think, one of the main takeaways that we got from this section. It's not surprising this is the one that you want to talk about first before we talk about employee stress and burnout. And for those who just joined us, there's 5 main sections that you can get the report from. And the reason there's so much meat is that we had you folks vote as to which section you wanted to talk about first. And the first one was just people priorities and turnover. And the next section that Dr. Voyles will walk us through is going to be around employee stress and burnout.
Yeah, so it's been a big theme, and I've noticed that a lot of HR leaders and C-suite leaders have really been bringing up this concern, not only for their employees, but experiencing it themselves. So we were curious to understand the relationship between emotional exhaustion and work location. And we found, and this is really surprising, but we found that remote workers, according to HR leaders, were experiencing more emotional exhaustion. And so in our poll question, which has just popped up for you, which of these factors do you think is the strongest driver of that higher emotional exhaustion in remote employees? We were surprised by this finding, and so we want to get your expert take on why remote workers are experiencing more emotional exhaustion. We found that hybrid workers experienced less emotional exhaustion, so about 81% of them were reported as having a lot of emotional exhaustion. The lowest group for emotional exhaustion, though, was in-person workers, so 68.91%. And so there's definitely a relationship between more time in the office and less emotional exhaustion. And so we're curious to see through the poll what you think is driving this effect.
Yeah, and while we're waiting for that, I'm monitoring the chat. So thanks everyone, and it's super robust. First of all, thanks Edna. I'm based in India. We are losing, but able to fill reasonably fast. It's disruptive. We just launched Tiny Pulse this month, so hopefully it's giving you a heads up on how your people are feeling. And then Dawn asked, would you recommend conducting stay interviews to help predict turnover? So Dr. Voyles, so what do you think about conducting stay interviews to predict turnover?
Absolutely. Yeah. You'll definitely want to make sure that you collect your data in a way that you can directly track who's staying and who's leaving based on the responses that they've given in their interviews. Also, exit interviews aren't a bad idea as well, to kind of see what are those pain points for employees who have decided to leave, though sometimes it's hard to catch them before they go.
Yeah.
But yeah, I highly recommend that.
Yeah, and I think from our experience, marrying that with anonymous surveys is super important, because you can either, so Don, you can either send an anonymous survey to ask them, how likely would you be working here? We used to ask 1 year, but now it might be in the next 6 months, and you'll get a sense and be able to slice it by departments, and then follow up with those exit interviews, like, oh, this department's higher, we might tailor different questions. Or you can flip it around. You can talk to a small subset about, you can ask about what's driving that. Ask that same pulse question about how likely will you be here in 6 months or 1 year, and then follow up with like, oh, what are these drivers if you're not going to be here? So that's a way to marry the two, so you have more information more quickly, so you can make better decisions.
Yeah, I would agree. Definitely to understand kind of what's happening for your employees now, and also what might happen later when you kind of have that attrition data to pair it with. Um, it's interesting. This poll actually mirrors the results of the same one last week. We found that work-life boundary issues was the most popular answer for why remote workers are experiencing more emotional exhaustion, and then followed by that reduced connection. Um, it's interesting. Last week, this one didn't come up, the video conferencing software fatigue, but it has popped up this week. So that's an interesting one to think about. And then last week, we didn't have anyone say lack of skills needed for remote work, and it's same for this week. So it seems like the biggest issue by far is that work-life boundary issue. And I'm sure that this is something we'll be digging into more in our Q3 results. So stay tuned. We'll have another one of these presentations, and we'll tell you what we've found. But yeah, so it's a big concern that with more time remote, people are experiencing more of that emotional exhaustion. Overall, we just looked at employee burnout and to what extent they are experiencing it. And 3 out of 4 HR leaders reported that their employees are experiencing anywhere from somewhat to a great deal of burnout. We only had 7.4% say that their employees were not experiencing any burnout. And so that really reflects this kind of pervasiveness of burnout right now. And it's definitely something that HR has been aware of. And it's something that's probably due to the circumstances with the pandemic and increased remote work. We also wanted to look at the correlations between stress levels and how that affects HR and employees' return to work attitudes. So correlations, when they're positive, essentially mean that as one thing goes up, the other thing goes up too. So when manager stress goes up, HR stress also goes up. And if you notice 0.610, that's a really robust correlation to find outside of a research lab. And this is significant at a p is less than 0.001 level. So this is highly significant and very strong. This means that when managers are very stressed, so is HR, which indicates that issues that are affecting them are also kind of impacting the whole organization. When HR is experiencing stress, HR rates their happiness as lower, so that's a negative correlation. So as their stress goes up, happiness goes down, not surprisingly. And then when HR feels that employees have negative attitudes towards returning to work, they report more stress. So that's how those correlations work. Whenever they're negative, one's going up and the other's going down. When they're positive, they're both going up together and both going down together. And so this reflects how different aspects of the organization affect HR and also affect kind of how they're viewing, return to work and their own stress.
And Dr. Voyles, related to stress and emotional exhaustion, we have a question is, do you think the burnout is related to not being able to go on vacation and not taking PTO?
Yes, I would say that's certainly part of it. I know that during the pandemic, a lot of people felt that they shouldn't waste their vacation because they couldn't go anywhere anyways. But now we found that many people are feeling overworked and many people feel that they need a vacation. In fact, in our Q1 survey, we found that people were more willing to take the vaccine if it meant they could go on vacation.
Yeah.
So I think there is definitely this need for a break for many people. And I know that organizations have responded to that. There have been, let's see, Bumble, for example, like closed their offices for a few days to address employee burnout. They specifically sent everyone home and said, this is a recovery day.
Mm-hmm.
So I think different organizations are finding a way to combat these issues.
Yeah, and then one last thing, I think it was Jules, Dawn, and Tammy talking about state interview resources. I think there's a bunch out there, and what we can do is Dr. Voyles and I can get together afterwards and send something out about some links and some suggested questions that we ask when we're doing state interviews as well. So I've got that jotted down, and can follow up accordingly.
Thank you for those questions. And it's great that you kind of asked those questions so that we can take what we've learned here and then also apply it to practical changes that you can implement in your organization. Now we looked at HR leaders' favorability towards returning to work, as well as how they rated employees' return to work attitudes. We found that they were really similar. So HR leaders were overall a little bit more favorable towards returning to work than employees. So about 57% were favorable, feeling good about it. And then 53% saying like, oh, my employees are feeling good about returning to work. We found that there was a high degree of correlation there as well. So as the HR leaders felt better about returning to work, they also reported their employees were feeling better about it as well. So let's talk kind of about burnout and emotional exhaustion broadly. We found that remote work results in higher levels of employee exhaustion. So that's something to keep an eye on if you have a lot of remote workers. Burnout is pretty rampant, whether it be in person or remote work. And then HR leaders are pretty stressed, and the more stressed they are, the less happiness they're experiencing. Um, and overall, they kind of believe that everyone's feeling slightly favorable towards work. And the more favorable the HR leader feels, the more favorable they also report their employees are feeling. So it's really important to inform your return to work plans by surveying your employees, pulsing them to understand how they feel, and then also adjust your plan as needed based on, for example, different roles and also different locations. So depending on what the current virus status is, as well as the needs of your organization and how your employees are feeling, as well as the characteristics of your employees as well.
Yeah, and on that note, I know the next section that we're going to be talking about is return to work. So, but while we're here, I love to hear from the audience is how do you feel your team's favorability is returning to work? And as Dr. Voyle said, have you already pivoted and made some changes that you announced something and then you heard from feedback in person, surveys, whatnot, and you've made changes based upon that? We certainly love to hear and learn from the community. So if you have any thoughts, please do drop it in the chat, and then we'll be able to share that, and it'll add more color as we go into the next section.
Yeah, I'm excited to see those responses because this is our kind of update. This is our pulse in a way in real time of what organizations are doing and how your employees are responding.
And
So,
Dr.
oh,
Voyles,
go ahead.
we just had a great question from, I think it's Lila McCain. Do you see a difference in return to attitudes by age?
Ooh, that's an interesting one, and that's not one that we've surveyed for. Um, oh, it would be all just conjecture if I tried to guess. And so I don't want to give a biased response without research to back it up. Um, what's your take? Although I would say organizations can actually measure that. If you know the ages of your employees, you could measure their return to work favorability compared to age groups.
Yeah, I would say that, you and I ran so many cuts of the data by
Oh, wait,
gender, by this, that,
it
and other
wasn't significant.
status. And the fact that it didn't come up probably means that we probably looked at it. I can't confirm that, but I'm pretty sure we looked at a lot of that, and it surprisingly didn't see a lot of variability.
It wasn't by race either. It wasn't significant. Yes, you refreshed my memory. Yeah, we looked at return to work by age and race, and those weren't significant, but gender was.
Yes,
Yes.
and I think that was one section that they didn't vote on yet, but hopefully we'll have time to get to
Ooh.
the fourth section. And then one last thing, Jules, thank you. Return to work is not applicable for my company since we've always been remote, but I think the lack of people being able to socialize as they normally would outside of work itself has led to that overlap and missing boundaries between work life, personal boundaries. And I certainly resonate with that thought and sentiment.
Yeah, just to illustrate it, I mean, especially during the worst of the pandemic, I think it was easier to work outside of regular hours because you couldn't really say like, oh, well, I'm doing, XYZ. I have an obligation. It's like, oh, well, I'm not doing anything. I guess I can answer that email. And we know from research that answering work-related communication outside of work hours kind of inhibits that recovery from work. And so that can increase burnout.
Yeah, and Kelly, that's a good point. She says that we are pretty split. Those who work near the office seem to want to get back, right? So they don't, their commute's pretty manageable versus people who might be driving for long distances and thinking like, oh, I could be actually working versus commuting.
I think we need to look into commute distance and how that factors in for our Q3.
Yeah.
So here we looked at how Q1 and Q2 compared in terms of how optimistic they felt about returning to business as usual.
Oh, and one quick
We have a
note,
quick
Dr.
poll
Wilson.
question.
Oh yeah, the poll. I just wanted to make sure that the audience heard that. Thank you.
Yeah. We've got a quick poll question for you. So if your organization is planning to transition back to that in-person work from remote work, on average, how many days a week do you plan to start requiring? So that's required, not optional, for in-person work. Not applicable if you are not returning or if you've always been in person. 1 day a week, 2, 3, 4, 5, or other. So we found in terms of business as usual that organizations are pretty much the same. They're 47% disagreeing that it'll be business as usual. And so this shows there's a shift in the workplace since the beginning of the pandemic. And many would point to the rapid switch to remote work being an indication of that. But we've also found a lot of consistency between these two, which indicates that things aren't rapidly changing now. We kind of had a rapid change and now we've stayed the same. We've kind of leveled out. So before we hit that poll, one of the driving kind of benefits of HR is the fact that hybrid work is related as the kind of best optimization for employee performance. So when employees are working from home as well as from work, HR leaders feel that they are most productive and performing the best. Now, the big surprise to me was actually that remote work was rated as the least kind of optimized for performance, with only 5.3% saying that that was best. In-person work was the second biggest behind hybrid work, but we were actually, and I'll kind of ask David to chime in here too, but I remember being very surprised by hybrid work coming up so far ahead in terms of the other categories.
Yeah, and I think that's one discussion point for you and your team is like hybrid. The reason why it's winning out is because it's better for emotional exhaustion, it's better for performance, and it's also better to mitigate attrition. So it's like that three-legged stool, and all three of them check the box. But I was surprised that hybrid was almost almost 2/3. But probably even more surprised that remote was so low at 1 in 20. So certainly that's something that we were like, huh? When we were a bit puzzled looking at that data. And the poll results just came in as well, Dr. Voyles.
Oh yeah, I see them. This one's actually a lot more spread out than other polls that we've had related to this question. It looks like, and actually let me click to where we can see that data. Here's from Q1. This is a comparison of how many days, actually, let's go ahead and skip to, hold on, actually, let's go on Q1 for now. We asked in Q1 how many days a week they were going to kind of be at work when they're coming back. And it looks like you closely mirrored it. 2 and 3 days were most popular for those who are kind of doing that plan. Although 2 days won out to this time, but only by a little. 3 days a week was most popular in Q1 by 37%. And so that was by far the majority. It seems there's a big spread. And so I'd love to hear in the chat if you want to drop your kind of explanations for why your organization has chosen 2-3 days. I think based on our data, you should be reassured that when we found 2-3 days a week, that was indicating lower predicted attrition. So you're kind of going the right way about this in terms of not requiring too many days suddenly back in the office.
Yeah, and since you asked, some of the chat is, like Deborah, most of our staff do not want to return to the workplace. Most really don't want to commute. We even have staff who don't feel comfortable attending an in-person all-staff retreat. Let's say, Susan, we're returning based on business needs in 4 categories: fully on-site, hybrid 2 to 4, fully remote and field-based. And also, I think it's Alana, I chose other days in the office will vary depending on jobs and duty. Yeah, so there's certainly a spread, but this seems pretty consistent with our past research.
Oh yeah, and Sherry, actually, this is an interesting one, said they decreased back to 2 days because of employee reactions and pushback. It's great that your organization was receptive in that way, and I think that's great for making sure that you can retain the employees that you have. Because certainly some employees may be very put off by a rigid return to work plan, and it could kind of cause them to start looking around. Thank you so much for your responses here. It's really informative to see, based on what our survey data is and what you're experiencing now.
Oh, another interesting one. Dawn said that they allowed their employees to choose. 98% of the employees chose 2 days a week. The other 2% chose 1 day every other week. Interesting.
Wow. It's excellent, Dawn, that you guys surveyed your employees and got that information so you could create a informed return to work plan.
Yeah.
we turned to look at favorability towards return to work by industry. And this was a really interesting one because we found that organizations in industries that require in-person work, so like construction, facility services, retail, wholesale, things like that, were the highest because they need to be there to do their job. But we found that like government and nonprofit, and particularly finance and insurance, were the lowest in their favorability towards returning to work. So basically, those in the industry of finance and insurance don't want to come back to the office. And much of this is probably due to the fact that they may see it as unnecessary. A lot of their job duties can be kind of done from a distance. And so when we look at that, I broke it down even further to look at the percentage, and 42.9% of HR leaders and C-suite leaders in finance insurance reported that their employees felt negatively about coming back to work. And so that highlights a attrition risk for employees who are feeling negatively about the policies that are being implemented on return to work. They may be more likely to turn over. So as a result, it's really not surprising that hybrid is actually the predominant current work arrangement. We found that for 36%, they reported a hybrid work arrangement. The second most popular was 100% remote. And then we have the kind of virtual by some, which some of you kind of indicated that's what you're doing in the chat in your organizations, that some positions can be virtual, others are in person. Only 15.5% were 100% in person. So this reflects the current state of work and where employees are working now.
And just from the chat, Dr. Voyles, Jeannie, we also let employees choose number of days back in the office, and over 50% of our staff chose to continue to remote work. Would you assume that this would then mitigate the attrition risk because remote work is a choice? And the data would suggest yes. It sounds like, you know, that's one of the driving factors. You're certainly rowing the right direction.
Yeah, I would certainly agree. Just basing it on the data, giving employees that voice. And then also, I would say monitor how they're doing with their remote work. So we do know that one of the things to watch out for is that emotional exhaustion. So even though they've chosen it, kind of make sure that they are able to manage those boundaries between their work and their home life. But I think it's great that you're making that informed policy. One of the big questions that we've asked in terms of remote workers, which is increasing due to the pandemic and also technology advances, is whether fully remote workers will be paid differently based on where they live. So for example, if you live in a state where the cost of living is very low, like Louisiana, your dollars will get you a lot further, your salary will get you much further than if you live in like California or Hawaii. So we found that 59.2% of companies that hire remote workers said they would pay them the same regardless of where they work. So if the remote workers in Louisiana or Illinois, they'll be paid the same. And then we found that 21.6% of those organizations would adjust based on the location. So if your workers are living somewhere a little more pricey versus somewhere a bit cheaper. And I know David has some insight on this as well, because a lot of the IT and computer companies are looking at this.
Yeah, and thanks to everyone for voting this up. And this relates to another question that is how do you address equity of return to work policies? So many of us have mixed fully remote employees and local employees in the same roles. How do you speak to teams about the requirements not being the same for different people in the same role? And this also obviously encompasses the idea of pay localization, which was a hot topic we were just interviewed for based upon this data set. And I think that, you know, it's easy sometimes for us on the coast, you know, we're in Seattle, to think, okay, you know, we pay a high wage, so we could pay it anywhere else. You know, like I used to live in Tulsa, you know, same rate as Tulsa. But it's hard for, if I lived in Tulsa and I was normalized against that rate, is will I adjust if I'm hiring someone in Seattle? And I think the crux of that is the perception of fairness and equity. Because so it has to be really deftly handled about how it's calculated. Like I was just talking to my friend at Microsoft when he was in the Bay Area, they had a band and they adjusted him up. When he moved to Seattle, they adjusted him back down. And but he's like, I didn't like it, losing money, but it was fair, and they were very transparent about it. So I think that's one also area that is another thing that's heaped on HR's plate, is like, oh, hey, we can recruit anywhere we want because we can hire remote employees. But then that perception of equity, last time when we ran this, we had someone in Boston saying that, people were moving to their office in Texas because of lower wage, same price. But then you had other people who were complaining and quitting because like, hey, how is that fair? When of course our cost of living is much higher here.
Yeah, so with this kind of new avenue for working with remote work, and it introduces a lot of complications where transparency is needed and clear, fair policies. And this is something you can also survey your employees about to better understand what they feel is fair, and also make it based on your business needs.
Yeah, and then sorry, this one just rocketed up to the top, Dr. Voyles, is
Oh yeah.
what is your recommendation for wait time with new return to work policies to survey? How quickly do you think employees would leave when unhappy? Would it be 2 weeks after implementation?
Okay, so I would expect that your employees would start looking, right, shortly after implementation, could even be sooner than 2 weeks after implication or implementation. But I would say that, just by the nature of applying for jobs, it takes a little while to interview and things like that. But by then you might have already lost them if they're already starting to get offers. So you want to make sure that before you even implement it, you have surveyed your employees. And you also want to make it clear that you're going to continue to survey them and get their feedback, so that they know that they're not powerless in this situation, and that they can kind of raise their voice and be heard in your organization. When they feel like they've not been heard and the policy is unfavorable to them, that's when they'll start looking. And then once they have job offers, it's pretty much game over there.
Yeah. All right. So, I know that we've been doing Q&A throughout, so I feel good about, let's try to squeeze in some of the highlights from the fourth section, which is, I think about beyond one size fits all advanced attribution, slide 10.
Sure. Do you want to move from here?
Oh, I'm sorry. No, let's finish this up. I've just been so engrossed in monitoring the
I
chat. My
I know
bad.
there's so many good comments. So I'll just highlight this slide pretty quickly, but we found that we looked at industry by work location, and medicine and health, retail and wholesale, manufacturing were the top for in-person, which makes sense. Things like pro consulting, computers and technology, finance and insurance were the lowest in terms of in-person work. And again, this makes sense. It's work that's conducive to doing it remotely. So this will be interesting to watch what these attrition trends are for these different organizations in terms of where they've been working in person or more remotely, and then how that will change. So we'll just kind of hit some of the key insights, and then we'll kind of go to look at those demographics. But we found that a lot of HR leaders are predicting that things aren't business as usual. Half of HR leaders are saying that things are different now that the pandemic has happened and we've had these changes to remote work. 63% of HR leaders suggested that the hybrid model is the best approach for optimizing performance. We've also found that 36% of organizations have adopted that hybrid model, which it looks like from all of our data, it's kind of triangulating on recommending that hybrid model for organizations that can do it. However, we found that pay is not adjusted for the majority of organizations that are hiring remote workers. So overall, we would, if it's possible, kind of recommend that hybrid work. It's the best arrangement for performance. It's also the kind of balance between emotional exhaustion for in-person and remote work. And it's also better for preventing some of that attrition with return to work policies. All right. Do we have a minute to go through that other data,
Yeah,
or
I
should
think
we
so.
go to our
I think I got
highlights?
3 minutes to zoom through. It's just so fascinating. Look at parental status, marital partner status.
Okay. Okay, we'll go through it quickly, but this will be just a taste. And if you want, I'd say get the full report because it's really interesting. But I got curious about how parental status and partner status affected stress levels, for example. And when I was looking into the data, I found that people who were single with children actually reported the lowest stress levels, which was a big surprise to me. and single with no children reported the highest. So that was kind of an interesting counterintuitive finding that we had. We also found that when we were looking at how people feel about returning to work, this is not so surprising. Those who are single with children reported that they are the least favorable towards returning to work because then they might have concerns of taking care of their kids who might be out of school. But for those who are partnered with children, they want to go back to work. They're ready. They absolutely are ready. And so this indicates the power of looking at your employees' life as a whole and their attributes to better understand what policies will suit them. And then lastly, we looked at happiness at work. And this was another surprising one. People who are single with children reported the highest happiness at work, and single with no children reported the lowest happiness. And David and I were kind of bouncing off ideas about this. And I was thinking that it's because people who are single with no children, when they're out of work, that's their happy time. They're going out for drinks with their friends and enjoying their life. People single with children, work is their break from their kids. David, what do you think on this?
Yeah, well, I think the research is pretty conclusive that when you have events, stressful events like 9/11 or COVID, that single people who live alone without any children or partners or roommates suffer disproportionately, and I think the data bears that out. And I think the single with children, yeah, we were trading ideas around that, and what Dr. Voyles shared, did pop up to the top. But if you have thoughts, please do let us know. But I think that's to reiterate, that's why it's so powerful. It's not one size fits all, right? Like I used to drop a survey question, get the results and make some decisions, but how do we start thinking about our people through their life cycles and as individuals? And can we contour some policies against that to make it more attractive to work at my organization so I can outcompete others? Because it's not just about money, it's about other policies and flexibility that we can offer to these different people with different characteristics and uniqueness in their life.
Yeah, so with that, let's go ahead and hit the very last slide, just to kind of wrap everything up. Some of the big things we found, hybrids here to stay. Also, we found that vaccinations were encouraged, but very rarely required. We also found that HR priorities have really shifted away from kind of engagement and more towards hiring and remote onboarding. And we're raising questions about this turnover tsunami versus the trickle. And so we absolutely suggest getting a handle on these issues by surveying your employees and also looking at those advanced attributes. So things like where your employees are working, so location, whether they're remote or in person, even parental status, gender, to better understand what policies your employees will need and what will benefit them and your organization.
Yeah, certainly. I think someone brought up like they have different classes of work environment depending on the classification of the employee. Is being able to survey those people and say like same question and be able to benchmark across that, because they may have different feelings, and it's great to understand that in totality. So with that, we promised you folks that there was going to be a lot of meat. Thanks for powering our Q2 State of Employee Engagement. If you actually responded, the Q3 one will be coming up. We're already thinking about how we refine it based upon a lot of the research and the robust chat that we had. And if you do want a copy of the customized, because you filled out the Q2, email Dear Andrew at tinypulse.com or put it in the chat. If you just want the generic version, Andrew has also put that in the chat. And for the SHRM and HRCI credits, I believe Andrew has also put that in the chat as well. So once again, thank you so much. And since we are a survey company and we care about your thoughts, after this, there'll just be a brief survey that'll take you 30 seconds to answer. It really helps myself, Andrew, and Dr. Voyles get better and create even better sessions for you folks in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.